The world tells us that trauma defines us, that it's insurmountable, but scripture and science tell a different story. Today, our guest is Nicole Wilke, and she's going to tell us how to build resilience in our children. Tell us, Nicole, what's your connection to our space, the foster and adoptive space?
Yeah, well, I would say there are many connections in my life. Maybe the most obvious is that I work for the Christian Alliance for Orphans, and I serve with their Center on Applied Research for Vulnerable Children and Families, really seeking to equip practitioners, leaders, parents, policymakers by translating the best available research to frontline practice. Um, and I've also worked as a marriage and family therapist, focused on serving foster, adoptive, and kinship families over the years as a missionary. But probably the most educational and challenging and enriching experience is growing up in a foster and adoptive family. So I have 9 adopted siblings, and I have 70 siblings through foster care throughout my life. My youngest sibling right now is 7.
Yeah, and I hear you're just one of us. It's in your DNA at this point because it's all throughout your history.
Mhm.
We hear early adversity and trauma talked about as if they're two sides of the same coin, and I'm curious, you address that in your book. Do you think it's true, and can you define both of those for us?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And I'm going to use sort of an expansive, somewhat simplified perspective there, but one that does align with what research says. And I actually want to just address what you said before as well, in saying that good science will always affirm the truth of God's scripture. When they don't mean, oftentimes it's just only revealing part of the story. And so when we start to look at them in concert together, we see so much more about who he is and how he created us and how he created the world. And that's where we begin to get these clues when we're looking at them in partnership. In terms of trauma and adversity, here's a way I think that we can define it. So, early adversity is observable. These are events or experiences that children will have that require them to respond in ways that we wouldn't term developmentally appropriate. So these are not things like they got a bad grade, or uh, they need to address a bully, for example. Like, these are sometimes things that we would need support from adults. We need to step in and help them, coach them. But these are normal stressors that children experience. Early adversity is more extreme than that. These tend to be things like um, abuse, neglect, violence, exploitation, the loss of a parent, having a parent who's in prison, extreme disability or health issues. So these are a little bit more extreme issues than what we would see as a typical stressor. These are observable circumstances, and objectively, we can see them. Okay. Now, here's the distinction between adversity and trauma. Trauma requires early adversity, but trauma also requires an instantaneous and subconscious perception of threat. So, usually, we're perceiving a threat to life or limb of our own. And then also, especially in really small children, this will happen when it is the primary caregiver, or the mother, the father, the grandmother. If they see that that individual has a mortal threat to their lives, that also um, can tend to bring out trauma. So it is not just the objective experience, but it's also that subconscious, subjective perception of threat. And that's why we can have two children experience the exact same thing. One has merely experienced early adversity, and one really has experienced trauma, which comes with hormonal responses, and there are physiological elements to that that then lead to longer term effects. Now, to be clear, we can recover from both of those. It just takes more intentionality and support to recover from trauma.
Yeah, those are great. I love that distinction of the subconscious perception of threat. That is really good. I've not heard that before. Okay, in your book, which I've read it and I love it and highly recommend it. I had some aha moments. I'll be sure we mention those, but you talk a lot about resilience. Tell me more about resilience.
Resilience is such a gift. And for those who are listening, who are caring for vulnerable children, caring for children who are experiencing difficult things, honestly, caring for any child. This is such a hopeful concept, and it's something that again aligns with science and scripture. But essentially, when we boil it down, it is the ability to overcome obstacles and then adapt in ways that actually grow you or improve you. So you are wiser, you are stronger, you are more capable. It is that idea of God taking something that the enemy means for evil and using it for good. It's not just neutral. It is actually a positive effect of overcoming something that's really difficult.
You talk about protective factors in your book. Can you name a few of them and offer practical ways we can help to build them for the children that are in our care?
Yeah, that's so good. And I think to give some context of why we want to know about protective factors, when we look at resilience, it's made in essentially what is a formula. Okay? So to make resilience, we need to have adversity or challenge or stress, and then we need to combine it with something else. So remember, if you just have early adversity, you're going to have negative outcomes. That's not what we want. We want to write a different story. So when we take early adversity and we combine it with protective factors, that's what can lead to resilience and these outcomes that are actually better than if we hadn't experienced these challenging things. So then the question is, of course, what is actually a protective factor? Sometimes protective factors are called anti-ACEs, anti adverse childhood experiences, or benevolent childhood experiences, beneficial childhood experiences. And essentially, they're things that will counteract those early adversities. So we boil those down into three categories. Those are individual protective factors. We can have family and social protective factors, and then we can have community or societal protective factors. So when we're looking at those individual protective factors, they can be things like skills that your child has. They can be positive experiences, relationships, having a good education, access to medical care. Those types of things are going to benefit the child. Even mindset is a really important protective factor. So things like the belief that I can overcome is really significant, way more significant than one would imagine. So interesting. We did a study where we saw that actually just the sense of belonging can increase a child's ability to overcome. Just believing that you belonged. We didn't look at what other people thought about your belonging, just your belief in belonging. An optimistic attitude, having optimism or a future focus is super significant. Thinking about today is not forever actually carries weight with kids. When we look at those family and social protective factors, obviously relationships with the family, especially attachment relationships with primary caregiver, but even extended family, siblings as well. Things like healthy communication, a warm atmosphere in the home, family goals together can be a protective factor. And then as we look at the community and societal factors, it's things like not living in an area of geopolitical conflict is very beneficial, or having a stable political system, having access to, again, good education, medical care, a church community, having access to a faith community is hugely, hugely beneficial. So there are things that we can do on all of those levels to make it more likely that our children will be overcomers.
I had my own aha moment that I'm going to name while reading the book. I just want to call it out. I tend to be a coddler, I was realizing as I was reading it. And it's one of those things where my husband's pointed it out to me a number of times. Of course, it takes somebody else pointing it out. But, I was realizing as I was reading it is I'm one of those people that go, oh, it's their trauma. And I kind of let the trauma make an excuse for behavior. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I really heard that throughout the book that we're not doing our kids a service when we do that. It's a real disservice to them.
Oh, and I think it's so common and it's so well intentioned, right? It often is this feeling of the world is hard, and especially when we're parenting children with early adversity, we're saying they've already experienced so much. I was teaching on this in a small workshop, and a mom came up to me afterwards and she said, "My kids have experienced more than a lifetime of trauma. I don't want them to experience one more hard thing." And she had essentially made that her job. And so that was a difficult conversation, and we've had many more since that, not with that individual, but this comes up a lot. And I think parents, especially moms, if I can just say that, often have this desire to nurture and protect. And of course, this is God-given and hugely important, but it can also be maybe overused, or or sometimes it feels good to do that, right? It really does. And it feels like the right and natural thing. And at the same time, our children will experience difficulties. Jesus promises that, right? He says, "You will have trouble in this world, but take heart, I've overcome the world." And so the challenging thing is that we can protect our kids more or less for their childhood, but we cannot do that in adulthood. Our job is actually to raise children to not need us. As hard as that is, I'm always saying to my girls, like, "I know you're 10, but you're always going to be my baby." And they're like, "Uh-huh. Okay." So there is that natural inclination of wanting to protect. But at the same time, the truth is, long term, your child's professor, your child's boss doesn't care. And when you say, "Oh, but they're not responding in a trauma-informed way," you're right. Trauma-informed is vitally important, especially in those initial stages. But we don't want to keep our kids in a position where they're feeling that they need special accommodations forever. And instead, over time, slowly, we're building their capacity. We're helping them to understand you can absolutely know that this has happened, and you can be aware of things, for example, triggers, and have plans in place for how you're going to deal with that. But we can't expect that your child's future spouse is always going to say, "Oh, it's not a problem, it's just the trauma," right? So instead, we're really thinking about doing it together. It's not saying, are we going to be trauma informed or are we going to move them towards overcoming? It's both and. And oftentimes, interestingly, part of that is our role in coming alongside them, acknowledging and normalizing and validating, while also pointing towards the future and what's to come and purpose and what I can be. So it's not an either or, it's a both and in this situation, but it is vitally important that by the time they're entering the world, and hopefully well before that as adults, they're clear on how they can contribute, how they can be part of it, and what to expect, what are realistic expectations for how people will respond to them.
Yeah. That we're not always doing a service to our child when we bend over backwards to accommodate the world to them. We really are preparing them for the world, is what I hear you say, and their jobs and their spouses and everybody else isn't going to be sitting there looking at a MRI of their brain and how, wait, early neglect caused this. We've got to really just prepare them for how can they accommodate themselves for the world. I love that. That was my big aha and takeaway that, darn it, my husband's right. I've been a little over accommodating as a mom. And I love that you acknowledge that's maybe the good part of us, but it can get overused, especially when we've got such great compassion for these kiddos in our care who have had so much early adversity. But the way to correct it isn't just to bend over backwards at all times and make excuses for behavior that isn't necessarily going to serve them well in life. Love that. Do you have any tools that parents can use to talk about resilience directly with their children?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's one of those situations where sometimes we as parents can understand a concept, and then when we try to translate it into kids speak, it can be challenging. So we actually created a kids book to accompany this book about a little koala and his journey to overcoming, and that can just give parents some language and some examples to be able to use with kids. We actually had a right away after we released this, we had a little kiddo who said, "Oh, now I have the courage to ride my bike," and has a little Caleb koala stuffy on the front of her bike, riding it with her, and we've seen several examples of that so far. So that's our hope, that this will create language for children and for parents to communicate with their children.
I do love that everything you do, everything that Christian Alliance for Orphans does, it isn't just rooted in scripture, which is, we all know, the base of who we are and the foundation, but you understand and know that science is truth and it is rooted in scripture as well. And so we don't hold back the evidence-based, the stuff that's proven and effective. And so just thrilled to have had you here with us today. Thank you for sharing your hard-earned wisdom.
Oh, it's such a treasure to be here. Thank you so much for the important work you're doing.